Sri Guru Sriyuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaisnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Varijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitandevam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha Umagyanatimirandasya Gyanangana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namane Gaurtishe Namaha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Brindamaneshwari Brishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaur Bhakta-vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Nama Hare Nama Eva Kevalam Kalo Nastyeva Gatiranyatha. Welcome everyone. Welcome Krishna Jivani, Gaur Narayana, Guru Nishta, Radha Madhava, Padmanabh Maharaj, Valeria Rachagni, and anybody else who's here. It's nice to see all of you beautiful devotees, all of you glorious devotees, like Dulal Chandra says. Today, by the grace of our Sripad Padmanabh Maharaj and Guru Maharaj, I'm beginning a new series. At first, I told Padmanabh Maharaj that I don't want to give another series immediately after the first one. And he said yes. And then about a day or so afterwards, he asked me that, what about this series? And he suggested the idea, and he said in a very smart way that Guru Maharaj has approved this idea. So after that, there wasn't much for me to do but say, okay. So in this short series of 4 parts, I'm going to speak about the art of giving class or speaking Krishna-Katha in our Gaudiya Vaisnava tradition. And my plan is to divide up this seminar into 4 parts. The first part today being about the philosophy and the theology of speaking Krishna-Katha. Then the second part will be the form and traditional ways in which to speak Krishna-Katha, kind of the etiquette of giving class, you could say. The third part will be on rhetorics and tips, advice, how to give class. And the fourth part will be practice. So for the fourth part, I will get back to that later, but I want to have some volunteers who will give classes of about 5 or 10 minutes. And I'll come back to why this last thing later on today. So, speaking Krishna-Katha, what can we say about that from a philosophical point of view? As Gaudiya Vaishnavas, our epistemology, or our way of knowing things, is based on Shruti, or sacred sound. Sacred sound, receiving knowledge through the revelation of sound. We learn everything we learn through Shrauta Parampara. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati liked this term very much, Shrauta Parampara, or the descent of Shruti, or the heard sound. And out of all of these sacred sounds that we take in and that we learn from and that we grow through, there's one particular form of revelation that forms the very core of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. If I would ask, let's say, Carolina, what would you say is the most important holy text for Gaudiya Vaishnavas?
Srimad Bhagavatam?
Yes, correct. Srimad Bhagavatam Puranamamalam and Srimad Bhagavatam Pramanamamalam. That's how Srinatha Chakravarti puts it in his kind of Gaudiya Vaishnava catechism, when he's in one verse describing everything that is important in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He says that Srimad Bhagavatam is the spotless Pramana, or the spotless source of knowledge. So whenever we as Gaudiya Vaishnavas want to find out something, whenever we want to learn something, really on whatever topic it is, it makes much sense to first turn to the Srimad Bhagavatam. So what does the Srimad Bhagavatam say about speaking Krishna-Katha? By the way, I also want to welcome some of newcomers, Sargrahi, Haripriya, Gopinath Acharya, and somebody who's called in on a number, welcome. And Govinda Dasi as well, welcome. So what does Srimad Bhagavatam say about speaking Krishna-Katha? Of course, many, many things. This is one of the wonderful things about our Srimad Bhagavatam, that it's such a huge and such a varied and rich scripture. But I always like to approach these kind of topics through the exemplary persons of the Srimad Bhagavatam. The Srimad Bhagavatam teaches very much philosophy, but many times the Srimad Bhagavatam teaches us through persons. And we have, of course, exemplary speakers of Krishna-Katha in the Srimad Bhagavatam. The very embodiment of Kirtana, or glorifying the Lord, is of course Shukadeva. There's a famous verse, Rupa Goswami includes it in his Padyavali, which gives examples of the ninefold processes of bhakti, example persons for each. The example of Shravanam is Parikshit, of listening, of hearing. And the example of Kirtana is Shukadeva. But the very first speaker of the Srimad Bhagavatam, if we read the book from the beginning, isn't Shukadeva. The Srimad Bhagavatam, after its invocatory 3 verses, takes us back to Naimisharanya. Once upon a time, in the forest of Naimisha, all the sages had gathered for 1,000-year sacrifice. But they were sitting there and they were offering, and most of what they were getting from the sacrifice was that they got black from the smoke. So they approached the first of all the sages, Suta Goswami. And they put questions to him. And do you remember, when you were reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, how does Suta Goswami begin his reply? It's very pertinent for our topic today. The sages, led by Shaunaka, they place several questions to Suta. And he begins by glorifying his guru. Yam pravrajandamanupetamapeta krityam dvaipayano virahakatara ajuhava, and so on. 2 beautiful verses. He speaks about the son of Vyasadeva, Shukadeva. and how he was self-realized from birth. When he left home and Vyasa called after him, only the trees replied, only the echo replied. So probably you remember these verses, beautiful verses. And they show something very important here. When speaking Krishna-Katha, just like Sutta Goswami, we have to begin by hearing. This is of course, a kind of matter of fact and simple thing that we can't speak about without having heard. But it's the first kind of philosophical point that I want to make today, and it's an important one. We learn to speak Krishna-Katha by listening. In every way. Somebody said in some discussion somewhere on Facebook that I really like how Bhrigupada is welcoming everybody individually. Is this something I made up in my huge intellect? Of course not. It's something I picked up from the wisdom of the sages.
You're breaking up, Bhrigu.
More profound level, we learn by hearing, in the sense that whatever we speak about Krishna is something that has been spoken to us. Whatever we speak, we have heard before, and we can't really say anything that we haven't heard. One of the things I did when preparing for this lecture was to see what things Srila Prabhupada had said about giving class, about speaking Krishna-Katha. And one of the things that he emphasized was you should never make up anything. You should repeat word by word what the previous acharyas have said. What does this mean? It can be understood as memorizing exactly a talk given by Guru Maharaj or Prabhupada, and then just repeating it exactly the same way. Perhaps trying to imitate Prabhupada's accent or Guru Maharaj's way of talking, using the same kind of language, the same kind of expressions. And that can be good. But it's not useful in the long run. Because however much I want to try to imitate Guru Maharaj, I will never become Guru Maharaj. Guru Maharaj is Guru Maharaj. And if I try to imitate him, I will just look like an idiot. So when Prabhupada says that we should repeat whatever we have heard, of course, he's not saying that we can't say anything with our own words. There wouldn't be any point in that then. Then we could just play the recorded lectures of Srila Prabhupada and so on. But he means that we should pass on the teachings that we have received. And this is the example that Sutta Goswami gives there right at the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam, in the beginning of the second chapter of the first canto. Not all speakers in the Srimad Bhagavatam do speak in the same way, but they all illustrate something. When we move forward a little bit in the story of the Srimad Bhagavatam, to the first chapter of the second canto, where Shukadev, the main speaker of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the person who embodies Krishna Kirtana, when he starts speaking, he speaks in a different way. He does not begin with Mangala Charana, with glorificatory words like Sutta did. He just begins speaking immediately answering the question of Parikshit. What should a human being do who is about to die? He immediately goes into the topic. But what's the background of Shukadeva Goswami? We can compare Shukadev's speaking to the speaking of Jada Bharata in the 5th canto. Probably you remember Jada Bharata, after Bharat Maharaj, having reached Bhava Bhakti because of aparad, fell down and had to be born again as a deer. Then after that deer life, he became Jada or dumb Bharata, the Bharata who doesn't speak and who pretended to be an idiot. He was this big guy with a huge body, and he pretended to be stupid and ignorant so that everybody would leave him in peace. So he didn't speak at all. He didn't speak a word, maybe just some something like this. But then when he was forced to carry King Rahugana's palanquin, and King Rahugana got upset with him because he was walking in such an irregular way in order not to step on ants. He realized that this king is influenced by rajas and tamas, but he's actually a good person. So he hadn't been speaking for his whole life. But when Rahugana started speaking to him, he replied, and he started speaking Krishna-Katha immediately, just like Shukadeva Goswami does. And with Shukadeva Goswami, of course, it was the same. Before Parikshit placed his question to him, he was also wandering around the world, like pretending to be a madman. We hear in the Srimad Bhagavatam how kids would surround him and throw stones on him and fart in his face and so on. But he would just be completely oblivious of anything. And then when the king asks him the question, he starts speaking. So we have two examples of teachers who keep silent before they start speaking. And the example here, of course, is that when speaking Krishna-Katha, we shouldn't say anything unnecessary. Sometimes it's better to be silent. In the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna speaks about speaking or the austerity of speech, he says that the best kind of speech is short and sweet. So Jada Bharata and Shukadeva, they both illustrate the importance of when we are formally speaking Krishna-Katha, to stay on the topic, to not just give some rambling talk about this and that, like we speak maybe in an ordinary situation, but to keep to the point, to speak sweetly, but also speak what is necessary. And to speak what is necessary is different, of course, in many different situations. So the kind of Krishna-Katha that a person like Jada Bharata is able to give, or a person like Shukadeva, is of course on a very different level than that of some Bhrigupada from Finland. So whatever we're speaking needs to be in accordance with our understanding and our adhikara or eligibility. That's why I mentioned how Maharaj pushed me to give this class, and mentioning that Guru Maharaj thought it would be a good idea. So in this way, I felt that I had some eligibility. These two Maharajas, they thought that I have something to say. So I'm trying to speak according to my understanding. And of course, you need to take me with a big pinch of salt. I'm a middle-aged white man who thinks he knows many things. And I will be mansplaining for you now how to give lectures for 4 lectures. So sometimes maybe I will have something of substance. Then you take that, and whatever else, just leave that to the side. But I will try not to overstep the boundaries of my adhikara. I will try not to say things that I haven't found in my own experience to be working and to be good when giving lectures. So how do we know what our adhikara is? How do we know what our eligibility is when it comes to speaking Krishna-Katha? I'll come back to this question a little bit later. But I want to say something more about the Srimad Bhagavatam, and that is that the Srimad Bhagavatam also gives us many other examples of persons speaking philosophy. Many times inspiring, good examples. Sometimes the Srimad Bhagavatam also gives us examples of how not to speak Krishna-Katha. We have in our house a weekly Srimad Bhagavatam study meeting. Some local devotees we've been meeting for a number of years, and we're reading a chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam every week. And we've reached now the 7th canto. And in the last meeting, now a couple of days back, we heard how Hiranyakashipu was consoling his mother and the wife of his brother Hiranyaksha, who had been when Hiranyaksha had been killed by Lord Varaha. So it was a whole fairly long chapter where Hiranyakashipu was preaching to these ladies and to a whole group of demons, how they shouldn't be sad and how they shouldn't be too much in sorrow over the death of Hiranyaksha. And it was a very interesting chapter because all the things that Hiranyakashipu said were correct. Maybe with one exception. Vishwanath Chakravarti was pointing out perhaps one exception. But in general, what Hiranyakashipu was teaching was true. He was talking about the impermanence of the body, how the bodies are brought together like people meeting in a restaurant. They come together and they go in different directions. Similarly with relationships. He was telling a story about Yamaraj coming to the wives of a king who had been killed. There was a story within the story. It was quite interesting and fascinating. And what I found to be the most interesting in that chapter was that Hiranyakashipu, after preaching in this way to his relatives, that they should understand that the hand of God is behind everything and so on and so forth. Really nice preaching. Then all the relatives, they gave up their grief and they went on with their lives. So it seemed like he was a successful preacher. But of course, he himself perhaps gave up his grief, but he certainly didn't give up his anger. So Hiranyakashipu preaching to his relatives illustrates how we can't really give something that we don't have ourselves. Jiva Goswami, when commenting on the issue of the Guru in the Bhakti Sandarbha, in the 203rd Anucheda of his Bhakti Sandarbha, the next to last part of his Shatchandarbha, he writes about different types of gurus. And quoting a Puranic verse, he says that there are basically 2 kinds of speakers, 2 kinds of teachers. One is a teacher that has attachments, and one is a teacher that is without attachments. The teacher with attachment to lust, anger, greed, these kind of things, may speak philosophy, but this kind of speech will not make a big impression on the audience. And even if it makes an impression on the audience, it will not make an impression on the speaker herself or himself. So again, who is eligible for speaking Krishna-Katha? Hiranyakashipu knew the philosophy, but his personal life wasn't very exemplary. He hated Vishnu. He hated the Devatas. He had a very dualistic view of the world. These are my friends, these are my enemies. So Hiranyakashipu is an example in the Srimad Bhagavatam of many different things, but here in this context of speaking, he's an example of a teacher who is not free of selfish interest and who is not free from the influence of lust, anger, and greed. Such a person may speak, but the influence will not be very big. So many times it is said that the person who gives a class should be a person who knows the philosophy, but who's also sheltered in transcendence. In this connection, Jiva Goswami cites a famous verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the 11th canto. Tasmad gurum prapadyeta jigyasu shreya uttama shabde pare chanishnatam brahman yupa samashrayam. This verse really speaks about the guru, of course. We know this verse. Therefore, one who is interested in the ultimate good in life should turn to a guru who is very well acquainted with Shabda and Para, and who is detachedly sheltered in Brahman. Jiva Goswami and our other acharyas, on commenting on this verse, explain that Shabda and Para refer to the Veda and also to Krishna. There's two Brahmans. There's Shabda Brahman and Para Brahman. The Brahman of words, the Vedic scriptures, and the highest Brahman, or Bhagavan, Krishna. So any kind of teacher, whether it is a teacher who is, Jiva Goswami calls a Diksha Guru, initiating teacher, or a Shiksha Guru, or an instructing teacher, or a Shravana Guru, a Guru that one hears from, such as a person who speaks Krishna-Katha, speaks on the Bhagavatam, and so on. Should ideally be a person like this, who has a good understanding of the scriptures, who has a good understanding of Krishna, and who is detachedly sheltered in Brahman. What does that last thing mean? Jiva Goswami explains there in the Bhakti Sandarbha Anucheda 202 that it means that this person is detached from the world, is not influenced by the big passions of this world, such as hate, lust, and so on. So this is a very high qualification that is required. Or sometimes, Guru Maharaj sometimes said like this, that ideally the speaker of Krishna-Katha should be a person who knows the philosophy, but who is also known to have a Brahminical disposition, in the sense of being interested in study, being interested in learning, and who also has an exemplary life, in the sense that this person doesn't speak one thing and then live something completely different. Still, this is a very high requirement, and one that I don't think that I can completely fulfill myself, for example. I know something about the philosophy. You can ask my wife whether my behavior is always very exemplary, and I'm afraid she's going to say no. So who can speak Krishna-Katha? Is it only a person like Guru Maharaj, or Padmanabh Maharaj, or some of you very advanced devotees? That would be best. No doubt that would be best, that the very advanced devotees would give Krishna-Katha. Because again, only such persons can really make a change in our heart. We can hear somebody like Bhrigu speaking, and that might be entertaining perhaps, or there might be some good points here and there, but it's not really going to change your heart. Nevertheless, I'm still speaking here, and nevertheless, I think that all of us should give lectures, at least sometimes. And this is not something that is different from what Guru Maharaj was just saying. Ideally, pure devotees should be giving class. But this world is seldom an ideal place. We don't always have the opportunity to hearing pure devotees speak. We don't always have the opportunity to finding that one type of company. And we're also very different. Guru Maharaj sometimes cites some verses from the first chapter of the Hari Bhakti Vilasa that speak about the Guru, and where it is said that a Brahmana Guru should initiate Brahmanas, a Kshatriya Guru should initiate Kshatriyas, a Vaishya Guru should initiate Vaishya disciples, and a Shudra Guru should initiate Shudra disciples. Whenever Guru Maharaj speaks about this verse, he always makes the point that this is a material consideration. Nevertheless, he says that it has some applicability to the modern world, in the sense that there are different types of people, and they will find themselves attached and attracted to different types of teachers. If we are of a artistic sensibility, or we're interested in art, and we're interested in how to express our Krishna consciousness through art, then we might be interested in hearing what persons like Saragrahi or Krishangi or others who are working with art and expressing their Krishna consciousness through art are saying. Or if we're interested in like how to apply Krishna consciousness to a socially very progressive and active life, then we're probably interested in hearing that kind of devotees speaking. And the thing is, and I think this is a very important thing, all of us here are expert in something. I know some of you here. There are others that I don't know at all. Govinda Mohini, for example. I have no idea what you are good at, but I'm 100% sure that there are some things that you are really expert at. And that if I wanted to learn those things, it would be very inspiring to hear from you about that. So when we are given something in Krishna consciousness, we receive those gifts with thankfulness, and we also feel we want to share them. And we have this experience, all of us, from the very first time when we got interested in Krishna consciousness. Somebody told us something about, let's say, the law of karma. And we went around to all of our friends telling them, do you know what this karma is? That there's this thing that whatever you do, you'll get the same result. And it happened to this one guy, he was doing this, and then a truck crashed into him, or whatever. We become very ecstatic and we want to spread whatever we've heard. And what we have heard might be so small like this. Like I remember I was speaking with my friend Kamalaksha after Guru Maharaj had been to Finland the first time. And Kamalaksha, after hearing Guru Maharaj's lectures, he told me, I thought I knew the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. That the philosophy of Krishna consciousness is that you're not the body, there's 3 gunas, you should surrender to a guru, and Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But he realized there's so much more. But whatever little we have, if we know about the 3 gunas, or we know about we're not this body and so on, we are called to spread all of that. Again, the ideal situation is that the pure devotee will come and tell about Krishna consciousness to everybody. But there are not that many pure devotees in the world. So we need to step up, all of us, and do our little part. We may not be pure devotees, but whatever little thing we have, we can share. And I think, and I'm a firm believer in this, that we can probably do much more than we think when it comes to speaking Krishna-Katha. Sometimes it's said that one of the main fears that people have, apart from the fear of death or the fear of losing a loved one or something like that, is the fear of public speaking. The fear of having to go in front of an audience where everybody is looking at you. What is Namarasana going to say? Is she going to say something stupid? What is she going to say? Why does she look like that? Why is she wearing that? We think that they're thinking all of these things. So that can be super scary. But it's an art that we not only can learn, but that we also should learn, to some extent at least. When I looked at what Prabhupada said about giving class, he also said that he remembered the first time he was asked to give class by one of his senior god brothers, and how nervous he was. He mentioned this in a conversation with some of his disciples, how nervous he was to give his first class. I also remember my first class. I was on traveling Sankirtan here in Finland with some devotees, and the leader of our Sankirtan party, he asked me to give class. I even remember the verse that I spoke on. It was from the first canto, from the story of Narada, one of the last verses of that 6th chapter of the first canto. And I remember how terrified I was, and how I made sure to speak all the proper things, like in those days, whatever classes, whatever verse it was, the class always had to end up with speaking about the importance of book distribution. So I did my best like that also. And it was a terrible class. I'm very happy that nobody recorded it and that nobody except myself probably remembers it. Terrible, awkward, lots of awkward silences, repetitions, forgotten things, and so on. But then I practiced more and so on. So we may not be, by our kind of disposition or our nature, we may not be brahmanas. Again, ideally, but we don't always have the opportunity to live in a varnashrama society. In one way, it's a very beautiful idea that everybody has their own task, that not everybody needs to do the same work, that if somebody is good at something, let that person do that. If Annapurna, for example, if she's really good at cooking, I have no idea if you are, but just as an example, Then if she's really good at cooking, then it makes sense to let Annapurna cook instead of having her work in the fields or something like that. But we're not always in such kind of situations. Like Sakyarati and Shamananda, where you're living, I don't think you have a huge devotee congregation there, where you can think that, okay, this Prabhu, he can take care of that, or that Didi, she can do that. Many times we find ourselves in situations where we need to kind of become quite independent and learn to do things on our own. I mentioned this Bhagavatam evenings that we're having in our house in Åbo in Finland. Nobody told us that we should have this program. We just decided, Saragrahi and I decided, let's start this. So a very kind of natural way of spreading Krishna consciousness is when devotees themselves decide to start doing things. And when they decide to become self-sufficient in a way. Prabhupada sometimes said that every devotee should be able to lead kirtan, give class, and cook a feast. Now, not all of us need to be expert in all of those things, but we should be able to at least throw together a khichdi or give a 5-minute presentation on why Krishna consciousness is a really nice thing. Because we may be called for that. We may be in a situation where there is no pure devotee or there is no great brahmana who can give the class. And not only that, not only the need, but it also can give us great satisfaction when we notice that we can do things that we didn't think we could. When I was a small kid, I didn't know what I would be when I grew up. Like some children, they know that they're going to be a fireman or an astronaut or something like that. I had no idea what I would be when I grew up. But I knew with 100% certainty what I would never become. And that, of course, was a teacher. So sometimes things end up in a different way than we thought. And even when we kind of find our identity in life, it can still give us great satisfaction to be able to do something completely different. I'm now in the countryside at our summer house. And here I need to do many kind of things, not only ring the bell and do puja and something like that. Sometimes I need to take the chainsaw and cut down a tree or something like that. And that's totally not my expertise. I'm not at all a big manly man. I'm this little weak wimp excuse of a man. But sometimes when I need to do something like that, it gives me very much satisfaction to see that, yes, I can do that as well, if I need to. Of course, if there's an expert here, if my cousin who works in the forest all the day, if he comes, then he can do everything better. But if I need to do it on myself, I can manage. So the same with giving class. We may not be expert, may not be our best ability or the thing that we are the best at, but to be able to overcome this fear of speaking in public can be something that is very empowering. And I think it's extremely important for us as sadhakas to get these experiences of being empowered. That I'm not just this little Bhrigu here in Finland. Sometimes Krishna is doing things through me. When Srila Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, when he sent his sannyasi preachers to the West, Srila Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj, Srila Bhakti Hriday Bon Maharaj, and Sambhidananda Prabhu, when he sent them, the first preachers to the West, he sent them off from Bombay, and he gave a talk, Lanwa, the messenger, that was recorded and that is available in, you can read it, for example, in Bhaktisiddhanta's book, Sri Chaitanya's Teachings. It's a short talk, and it's a beautiful talk where he's really pouring his heart out. And he begins by saying, it's a happy day for us to be able to spread the teachings of Lord Chaitanya to foreign shores. And you can imagine his feelings of happiness and triumph that now, after hundreds of years of Christian missionaries coming to India, we Vaisnavas are now sending our missionaries to the West. And he says many beautiful things in that talk. He says, for example, that the preacher should always think of himself as simply a conductor of the message of Sri Chaitanya. He's the living drum. The preacher is the living drum of Krishna Kirtan. Somebody else is playing on him. He's not the person making the sound. Somebody else is beating him to make the sound come out. Who is this somebody else? Guru and the Vaisnavas. So the preacher is simply the via medium, repeating in her or his own words whatever she or he has heard of Krishna consciousness from before. And Bhaktisiddhanta in this talk, where he's instructing his disciples how to approach people in the West, he's stressing very much one verse, which he says is the essence of all advice for the sadhaka. Those of you who heard Padmanabha Maharaja's Gaudiya Vaisnava etiquette series will remember probably the first verse that he started out with. Trinadapi sunichena, tarorapi sahishnuna, amanina manadena, kirtaniya sadahari. Kirtana can mean many different things. If we look up Kirtana in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the kind of basic and foundational book on bhakti in our sampradaya, Rupa Goswami doesn't describe Kirtana as giving class or speaking Krishna-Katha. In Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Kirtana refers to loudly chanting the glories of Krishna, either the name, the qualities, or the leelas. Uchchair bhasha, with a loud voice. So singing, congregational singing, that's Kirtana. But of course, Kirtana can also refer in a more broad sense. It can refer to spreading the message of Krishna, glorifying Krishna through talks about Krishna. So for this reason, this verse, the third verse of the Shikshastaka, is very much applicable to giving class as well. Trinadapi sunichena, tarorapi sahishnuna, amanina manadena kirtaniya sadahari. Mahaprabhu says that we sadhakas, we should make a garland, we should make a mala out of this verse, and we should carry it around the neck. Some devotees literally do that by making these small things hanging from their neck beads with the syllables of this verse. And that's a nice thing. But I think that Mahaprabhu is speaking more metaphorically here. We should always carry this verse around our neck. We should let this verse define us as sadhakas. To be more humble than a blade of grass, to be more tolerant than a tree, to always give respect and credit to others and never expect it for yourself. If we are able to embody these principles while speaking Krishna-Katha, that will be extremely powerful. And there are, of course, so many examples of this in our Gaudiya Vaisnava history of teachers who, through embodying these qualities, have been able to make a real impression on their listeners. If we're not embodying these principles, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati says in this talk, we will not be able to touch the heart of the listeners. So Trinadapi Sunichena, Tarorapi Sahishna. More humble than a blade of grass, more tolerant than a tree. Always giving respect to others and never expecting respect for ourselves. This is the heart of successful Krishna-Katha. And of course, in the upcoming lectures, like I said, I'm going to speak more about the practicalities, how to build up the lecture, what things to do, what things to avoid, these kind of details, these kind of tricks of the trade. But that should all be seen as footnotes to this verse. So that's what I wanted to say today. Any questions or comments?
You changed my heart, Bhrigupada Prabhu.
Will you be one of the volunteers, Marha?
I would love to try it. I mean, I have all the worries that you can imagine, but I don't know if I can because I'm cooking at that time for Maharaj. Unless it's later on, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Another, the date is later.
Yeah, we can see. But I'm just thinking,
Okay.
because, for example, yesterday in Archana Siddhi's series, when she was speaking with Sumati, I wasn't able to attend, but I listened to it later on today when I was doing some scrubbanam at work, at home. I listened to that talk, and it was such a beautiful and so profound and really, really moving and inspiring talk. And she said that she had been terrified and so worried and nervous in advance, but I was so happy that she gave that interview. Because if you haven't heard it yet, then go back and listen to it on the Tattva Viveka page. It's wonderful. Anything else?
Bhrigu, can you hear me?
Yeah.
That was a great class. It's really nice to hear, all the theory and stuff. I've given just a couple of classes my whole time of being an ashram devotee, which is kind of funny. But I wanted to specifically ask, like, for this class that you gave today, how much did you prep? Because it seems to flow so naturally, and I'm wondering, like how much of it did you know it was you're gonna use these examples and whatnot, and how much of it is just like spontaneous?
Well, that's a good question, but my answer, don't take this answer too seriously, because if you say you've just given a few classes, I've given lots of classes. The first class I mentioned was in '92, so it's many classes since then, and I'm giving classes as my profession as well. So I have experience, and experience really helps, because you learn then by experience how to, for example, build up a class, how to go from one thought to another. That's something I learned from Guru Maharaj also. He's able to keep in his head like so many threads, and he can go from one point to another and another and another, and then he comes back always to the main point. So to do something like that you need experience for that. So for this class, I would say that I prepared I was thinking about this class already since Maharaj asked me, but for particularly this class, I started thinking about it maybe on Monday. But then I prepared today. I used maybe all in all like half an hour to kind of properly prepare by reading some things from Prabhupada and Bhaktisiddhanta and so on. But then I was thinking about it while driving out here to the countryside and so on. So I was kind of in my mind, I was going over it and planning it. But I didn't do any notes, for example. And that I did in the beginning. I always made very careful notes and kind of like a flow chart. I never found it. Sometimes I write my talks if I'm going to give a kind of a formal lecture at some university thing. But nowadays I seldom do that. But sometimes I make kind of a flow chart that go from this verse to that, then go from there to this. But I don't need to do that nowadays. But I wouldn't recommend it to a beginner not to do that. It's much better to have like proper notes and to really prepare. But I'm going to come back to these kind of things, especially the third lecture.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
I want to quickly add that Maharaj should totally give classes. There's so much, she's done so much sacrifice and surrender. So there must be huge gems there hiding.
Yes, I'm sure about the same thing. Anything else?
I would just like to say something, and maybe you can, I don't know if there is a really point of what I'm going to say, but like when I was teenager, I was full of ego. I still am, but in a different way. And I had experience to talk like in front of 700-800 people, and I had no shame at all. I was super proud of myself. But then during the years, like life gave me big teachings, that humbled me in a certain way. And now, for example, I definitely not looking forward to talk in front of 700 or 800 people. And and also often we hear like preachers who are not genuine, but still they have a lot of followers. So somehow they catch you before you mentioned to change the heart if someone is talking about Krishna purely, but maybe this preacher is just catching their ego, or I don't know if you can just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. And the first thing that you mentioned about yourself, that's also quite interesting, because many times we hear the opposite, that when I was young, I was so shy, but now, like I used to be super shy, like terribly shy. I would get red if I just opened my mouth, I would get all red in the face. And if I didn't get red, I would be worried that I would get red in the face. So then I got red in the face from worrying about that. So really this kind of nerdy little boy. But sometimes, of course, it can go in the other direction as well, like you're mentioning. But I think that in your case, probably this was a good thing, because it's through wisdom that you see that perhaps the things that you thought you knew when you were younger weren't that kind of solidly. There wasn't such a solid foundation to it. And that, of course, ties in with your question that yes, there are some teachers who can make a big impression, even without being very, very kind of real. And there's plenty of examples of that in the history of rhetorics and the history of speaking. Persons like Churchill, for example. If you've heard any of his talks, they're very powerful. He was a master of how to speak and how to inspire people. And as a person, he was the worst, like a total racist. He really hated India. He hated Indians. He thought that Gandhi was just a clown and a disgusting beggar, and like on the personal plane, a very disgusting person, but very good with words. So a person like that can, for some time, make an impression on people's egos and even get them to sacrifice, like he did, or people like Goebbels or Hitler were able to do. But that's a different thing than speaking spiritually. So a powerful speaker, an experienced and charismatic speaker, can get people to do things. But when it comes to spiritual life, then there's something else. At least when we're speaking about the long run, the long haul. Because we can see people like Hiranyakashipu in the Srimad Bhagavatam. He makes DT and what was the name of Hiranyaksha's wife? Do you remember, Saragrahi?
Was it something Raush, Hava, something like that?
Something
I
like
don't
that.
know. Yeah.
Anyway, he managed to convince them for the moment, for a little while. He managed to awaken in them what Prabhupada calls Shmashana Vairagya, or the detachment of the crematorium. Like for a little while afterwards, you feel like somebody has died, that, oh no, I need to become serious now about my life. Life is short and so on. So for a little while, he managed to do it. But then they're kind of falling back into their old habits and their old demoniac nature. So a charismatic person is able to do that, but to make a lasting impression, then you need a pure person. So that would, I hope I answered a little bit what you asked about.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Pronounce. What should we strive to accomplish with giving a lecture, like when we are not a teacher without attachments?
That's a very good question. Well, many times it helps to think of yourself as a sevaka, as a servant. Like I can honestly say that I would never have chosen to deliver this seminar on my own. But when I got this order, then I thought, okay, Maharaj wants me to do this. Guru Maharaj says it's a good idea. And some devotees also said that, oh, this sounds like a good thing. So then I thought, okay, let me speak to serve them, to try my best to serve them. So that's how we should think as speakers, that how can I serve these people? How can, if you, let's say you're speaking at you're distributing prasadam, and then you get a chance to speak a little bit. So what can I say that will benefit these people? Instead of thinking, how can I make them think I'm a really wise and great person? But what can I say that will be a benefit to these people? So that's usually the best way to kind of approach the task.
Thank you.
Final question. Okay, thank you all very much. Jai Shri Shri Guru Gauranga Vikari Shri Shri Radha Madan Mohan Radha Govinda Radha Gopinatha Radha Ramada Radha Sham Sundar Radha Ramada Radha Gokulananda Radha Madhava Duchi Gopal Nitai Go Shri Sarvuj Giriraj Ki Jai Jai Vishnuvad Pranam Sabrarajacharya Stotra Shata Shishimad Bhakti Vedanta Tripurari Goswamaraj Lagurdev Ki Jai Jai Nitya Krishna Vishnuvad Bhai Charana Arvind Bhakti Vedanta Swamaraj Bhrighupada Ki Jai जय नितले प्रविष्ट विष्णुपाद भक्त रक्षक श्री राधे गोस्वामी महाराज की जय। जय नितले प्रविष्ट विष्णुपाद भक्त सिद्धांत सरस्वती गोस्वामी महाराज श्रील प्रभुपाद ठाकुर की जय। जय गौर किशोरदास बाबूजी महाराज की जय। जय सच्चिदानंद मोहि ठाकुर भक्ति विनोद की जय। जय वैष्णव सर्वमरला जगन्नाथ दास बाबूजी महाराज की जय। जय गौरी वेदांताचार्य श्रील बालाजी विभूषण प्रभु की जय। जय विष्णु चक्रवर्ती ठाकुर की जय। जय श्रीनिवास श्यामानंद नरोत्तम प्रभु त्रय की जय। जय कृष्णदास कविराज गोस्वामी महाराज की जय। जय व्यासवतार श्री वृंदावन दास ठाकुर महाशय की जय। जय श्री रूप सनातन भक्त रघुनाथ श्री जीव गोपाल भक्त श्रवण षड गोस्वामी प्रभु की जय। जय नमाचार्य श्री हरिदास ठाकुर की जय। जय रवि रामानंद आदि गौर पार्षवृंद की जय। जय प्रेम से कोश कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि श्री गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। जय श्री अंतर्द्वीप मायापुर सीमांतर्द्वीप मध्यद्वीप कोलद्वीप ऋतुद्वीप चांद्रद्वीप मध्यद्वीप मोद्रद्वीप ओद्रमद्वीप रुद्रद्वीपात्मक श्री नवद्वीप धाम की जय। जय श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोप गोवर्धन द्वादश वर्णात्मक श्री वृंदावन धाम की जय। द्वादशोपम की जय। जय राधा कुंड श्याम कुंड गंगा यमुना तुलसी भक्ति देवी की जय। जय श्री पुरुषोत्तम धाम की जय। श्री जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्र सुदर्शन की जय।